At 6:47 a.m. on May 2, 1968, Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez stood beside a helicopter at Forward Operating Base 31 in South Vietnam, listening to radio transmissions from a 12-man reconnaissance team surrounded by an estimated 1,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars. The team, call sign Bright Light, had been inserted into dense jungle to gather intelligence but had walked into a battalion-sized NVA force. Their radio operator was screaming that they were being overrun, that half the team was already dead or wounded, that they needed immediate extraction or everyone would die. Command was telling them extraction was impossible. The NVA controlled the landing zone with machine guns and mortars. Any helicopter attempting landing would be destroyed. Benavidez, a Green Beret medic with 5th Special Forces Group, was supposed to be on stand-down, recovering from previous injuries sustained during earlier missions. He had been wounded twice already during his Vietnam tour, shrapnel wounds, from a grenade that left scars across his back and a bullet graze that required stitches. Medical staff had recommended he take light duties for 2 weeks to allow complete healing, but Benavidez knew several men on the reconnaissance team personally. They were friends, fellow soldiers he'd trained with, men he'd shared bunkers and meals with during months in country. The thought of those men dying while he stood safe on base because of minor wounds was unacceptable. He grabbed his medical kit, picked up an extra ammunition bandolier and grenades, and climbed aboard the extraction helicopter without orders, without authorization, and without informing anyone he was going. The helicopter pilot, Warrant Officer Louis Wakefield, saw Benavidez boarding and said, "You're not cleared for this mission. Get off." Benavidez replied, "Those are my friends dying out there. Fly, or I'll find another pilot." Wakefield, recognizing that arguing was futile and understanding the desperation driving, Benavidez said, "If we go in there, we're probably all dying. You understand that?" "I understand," Benavidez said. "Let's go get them." The helicopter lifted off at 6:52 a.m., carrying Benavidez, the crew, and knowledge that landing in the hot LZ would likely be suicide. The UH-1 Huey helicopter, call sign Dust-Off 71, was a standard medevac aircraft, thin aluminum skin, providing zero ballistic protection, large fuel tanks vulnerable to incendiary rounds, and a turbine engine that could be disabled by a single well-placed bullet. The crew consisted of Wakefield as pilot, Warrant Officer Ernest Sylvester as co-pilot, and 2 door gunners manning M60 machine guns. None of them were supposed to be flying this mission. Command had already declared the LZ too hot, but all had volunteered after hearing Benavidez insist on attempting extraction. The flight to the contact area took 11 minutes, covering approximately 23 miles of dense jungle. During the flight, Benavidez checked his equipment: M16 rifle with 6 magazines, 180 rounds total; M1911, 45 caliber pistol with 3 magazines, 21 rounds; 6 fragmentation grenades, medical kit containing morphine syrettes, battle dressings, tourniquets, and basic surgical supplies, and 1 smoke grenade for signaling. He also carried a large survival knife on his belt, a weapon he'd purchased himself because standard-issue knives weren't substantial enough for the close quarters, fighting that Special Forces operations sometimes required. As they approached the contact area, radio transmissions from the reconnaissance team became increasingly desperate. Team leader Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright transmitted at 7:01 a.m. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they're inside our perimeter. Where's that bird?" His voice was strained, punctuated by the sound of gunfire close enough to distort the microphone. In the background, someone was screaming, the distinctive sound of a man who'd been wounded badly, enough that pain overwhelmed military discipline. At 7:02 a.m., Wright transmitted again. "I can see them maneuvering. They're forming up for assault. They've got us 3 sides. We need extract now or mark our position for airstrike because we're not walking out of here." The transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by static, suggesting Wright's radio or the team's antenna had been hit. This was ominous. Without radio communication, coordination between the helicopter and ground team would be nearly impossible. Wakefield descended toward the LZ at 7:03 a.m., coming in fast and low to minimize exposure time to ground fire. The LZ was a small clearing approximately 75 meters in diameter, surrounded by elephant grass and triple canopy jungle that made it invisible from altitude. The only way to find it was by following smoke from the reconnaissance team's smoke grenades, purple smoke that marked their position, but also marked it for NVA forces who could see the smoke as clearly as the helicopter crew could. As the helicopter descended through 1,000 feet altitude at 7:04 a.m., NVA ground fire began. Tracers, bullets with phosphorescent compounds that left visible trails, arced up toward the helicopter from multiple positions. The door gunners returned fire, their M60 machine guns hammering out rounds at 550 rounds per minute, the brass casings ejecting and piling up on the helicopter floor. The volume of incoming fire increased as the helicopter descended. What started as sporadic fire from scattered positions became a concentrated barrage from multiple machine guns and hundreds of individual rifles all firing at the same target. At 500 feet, the first rounds hit the helicopter. Bullets punched through the thin aluminum floor, through the walls, through the windscreen. One round passed between Wakefield and Sylvester, missing both by inches, and exited through the roof. Another round hit the fuel tank, but miraculously didn't ignite the aviation gas. The bullet was a standard ball round rather than incendiary, passing through the tank and creating leaks but not explosion. A third round hit one door gunner, Specialist 4th Class Jesse Sanchez, in the leg, the bullet breaking his fibula but not immediately disabling him. Sanchez continued firing despite the wound, knowing that suppressing NVA fire was the only chance of survival for everyone aboard. At 100 feet, at 7:04:30, Wakefield made the decision to commit to landing rather than abort. The helicopter was already damaged, already taking fire, and aborting now would mean the reconnaissance team would die. He brought the helicopter into hover at 10 feet above the elephant grass, unable to land fully because he couldn't see the ground through the dense grass, and landing blind risked crashing into obstacles. The hover, while necessary, made the helicopter a stationary target. NVA gunners, seeing the helicopter stationary, concentrated fire on it. The sound inside the aircraft became deafening. The rotor noise, the engine screaming at maximum power to hold hover, the door gunners' machine guns firing, and the constant metallic impacts of bullets hitting the aircraft's structure. Benavidez didn't wait for the helicopter to stabilize. At 7:05 a.m., with the aircraft still settling into hover and rocking from rotor wash and bullet impacts, he jumped. The 10-foot drop into 7-foot-tall elephant grass was blind. He couldn't see the ground, couldn't judge the landing, couldn't prepare for impact. He hit hard, the impact jarring his spine and making his previous back injury flare with pain. He rolled as trained to distribute impact force, came up in a crouch, oriented himself toward the sound of gunfire 75 meters away, and started running. He covered 20 meters before the first bullet hit him, striking his right leg just above the knee. The impact spun him, the leg collapsing under his weight, and he fell into the grass. He felt the distinctive burning sensation of a bullet wound, felt blood running down his leg, felt his body screaming at him to stop and apply a tourniquet and call for medical evacuation. Instead, he pushed himself up and continued running on the wounded leg toward his friends who were dying. Over the next 6 hours and 47 minutes, Roy Benavidez would be shot 7 times, hit by shrapnel 28 times, bayoneted twice, and clubbed with a rifle butt. He would hold his intestines inside his stomach with one hand while firing his rifle with the other. He would be declared dead twice, placed in a body bag while still alive, and would spit blood on a doctor's face to prove he wasn't dead. He would save 8 men's lives while sustaining wounds that should have killed him a dozen times over. And he would survive to receive the Medal of Honor 13 years later, when the full story of his actions finally emerged from classified records and witness testimony. If you want to see how one medic took 37 separate wounds and refused to stop fighting for 6 hours, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories of people who wouldn't quit when their bodies said, stop. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the longest and bloodiest individual action of the Vietnam War. Back to May 1668, and the moment Roy Benavidez decided dying with his friends was better than living safe on base. Roy Benavidez was born August 5, 1935, in Cuero, Texas, to a Mexican-American family. His father died when Roy was 2 years old, his mother died when he was 7, and he was raised by an uncle who worked as a sharecropper. Benavidez grew up in poverty, experiencing discrimination as a Mexican American in 1940s Texas, dropping out of school after 7th grade to work in fields to help support his family. He enlisted in the Army in 1955 at age 19, seeing military service as the only path out of poverty and toward a better life. His early military career was unremarkable. He served as a regular infantryman, receiving standard training, achieving average performance reviews. In 1965, during his first tour in Vietnam, he stepped on a landmine that broke his back in multiple places, shattered his spine, and left him paralyzed from the waist down. Doctors at Walter Reed Army Medical Center told him he would never walk again, recommended medical retirement with disability pension, and began processing his discharge from the Army. Benavidez refused to accept this diagnosis. He spent a year in physical therapy, working through excruciating pain to regain use of his legs, forcing his damaged nerves to reconnect, building strength in muscles that doctors said were permanently destroyed. He would sneak out of his hospital bed at night to attempt walking, falling repeatedly, tearing surgical repairs, causing doctors to threaten restraints if he didn't stop injuring himself further. After 12 months of unauthorized rehabilitation that medical staff said was impossible, Benavidez could walk again. Doctors couldn't explain his recovery. The spinal damage should have been permanent. He not only avoided medical discharge, but volunteered for Special Forces training, passing the physically demanding selection course despite his back injuries, and qualified as a Special Forces medic in 1967. He deployed to Vietnam for his second tour in early 1968, assigned to 5th Special Forces Group, conducting reconnaissance operations along the Cambodian border. His previous landmine injuries had left him with chronic back pain, reduced flexibility, and medical restrictions that should have prevented combat deployment. He ignored the restrictions, deployed anyway, and was conducting combat operations within weeks of arrival. The morning of May 1968 started as routine. Benavidez was at Forward Operating Base 31, processing after-action reports from previous missions, when the call came that a reconnaissance team was in contact with large NVA force. The team, 12 Green Berets and South Vietnamese commandos, had been inserted by helicopter at dawn to conduct reconnaissance of NVA infiltration routes. Within 30 minutes of insertion, they encountered a dug-in NVA battalion, estimated 800 to 1,000 soldiers, and were immediately engaged. The reconnaissance team's radio calls documented the deteriorating situation. At 6:35 a.m., Team Leader Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright reported, "Heavy contact, unknown enemy strength, taking casualties, need extraction." By 6:45 a.m., Wright reported half the team dead or wounded, ammunition critical, position being overrun. By 6:50 a.m., Wright was begging for extraction. "If you don't get us out in the next 10 minutes, write us off. They're inside our perimeter." 3 helicopters attempted extraction between 6:50 a.m. and 7 a.m. All 3 were driven off by intense ground fire before landing. 1 helicopter took 17 hits. Another had both door gunners wounded. The third had its engine damaged and barely made it back to base. After the third failed attempt, Command declared the LZ too hot for further extraction attempts and began discussing artillery strikes on the area to prevent NVA capture of American bodies and equipment. This was when Benavidez boarded Warrant Officer Wakefield's helicopter and insisted they attempt extraction. The helicopter approached the LZ at 7:04 a.m., flying at maximum speed, weaving to avoid ground fire. NVA forces, recognizing that Americans were attempting another extraction, concentrated fire on the approaching helicopter. Tracers filled the air around the aircraft, visible even in daylight, as streams of bullets converging on the helicopter. Multiple rounds hit, damaging hydraulics, fuel lines, and control surfaces. But Wakefield maintained control and brought the aircraft to hover 10 feet above the elephant grass. Benavidez jumped at 7:05 a.m., landing hard in grass tall enough to hide a man. He immediately began running toward the sounds of gunfire 75 meters away, where the reconnaissance team was fighting. The grass limited visibility to approximately 10 feet, meaning both friendly and enemy forces were operating nearly blind, relying on sound and brief glimpses of movement. The NVA knew Americans were in the grass somewhere and were firing continuously into likely positions, saturating the area with automatic weapons fire in hopes of hitting targets they couldn't clearly see. The first bullet struck Benavidez at 7:06 a.m., approximately 20 meters from where he jumped from the helicopter. The 7.62mm round, fired from an AK-47, hit his right leg just above the knee, penetrating the quadriceps muscle and exiting the back of his thigh. The impact was like being hit with a sledgehammer. Instant pain, leg collapse, blood flow. Benavidez fell, his wounded leg unable to support his weight. Standard procedure for leg wounds is immediate tourniquet application to stop bleeding, followed by evacuation to medical facilities. Benavidez had medical training and supplies to treat the wound properly. Instead, he wrapped a pressure bandage around his thigh in approximately 15 seconds, cinched it tight enough to slow bleeding, and continued toward the reconnaissance team. The bandage wasn't proper medical treatment. It was expedient field dressing, designed to keep him mobile for the next few minutes. Proper treatment could wait until after he'd reached his friends. He ran another 15 meters before encountering the first wounded reconnaissance team member, Specialist 4th Class Brian O'Connor, lying in the grass with a bullet wound in the abdomen. O'Connor was conscious, in shock, bleeding internally, and unable to walk. Benavidez grabbed O'Connor by his equipment harness and began dragging him toward the helicopter landing zone while continuing to move toward the rest of the team. This created a tactical problem. Benavidez needed to move toward the team to reach more casualties, but he needed to move toward the helicopter to evacuate O'Connor. He compromised by dragging O'Connor laterally while moving generally toward the heaviest gunfire. At 7:09 a.m., Benavidez found the main defensive position where the remaining reconnaissance team members had formed a perimeter approximately 30 meters in diameter. The scene was catastrophic. Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright, the team leader, was dead, shot through the head while attempting to call in air support, his body lying beside the destroyed radio. Sergeant First Class Lloyd Mousseau was dead. Multiple gunshot wounds to the chest. Died attempting to drag a wounded comrade to cover. Staff Sergeant John Paul Yonkman was wounded in the leg, a through-and-through bullet wound that had shattered his tibia, but he was still fighting, propped against a tree, firing his CAR-15 at NVA positions he could hear but barely see through the elephant grass. Specialist 4th Class Brian O'Connor, whom Benavidez had passed earlier, had crawled back to the perimeter despite his abdominal wound. Sergeant First Class Floyd O'Connor, no relation to Brian, had been shot in both legs and couldn't walk. Staff Sergeant Daniel Shipley had shrapnel wounds across his back and was bleeding from multiple lacerations. Sergeant Jesse Yagu had been shot in the shoulder, the bullet fracturing his clavicle. 3 South Vietnamese commandos attached to the team were also present. 1 dead, 1 with a sucking chest wound that made breathing difficult, 1 with relatively minor wounds but in shock and unable to fight effectively. The defensive position was barely holding. The team had approximately 120 rounds of rifle ammunition remaining among all functional fighters, 2 grenades total and 1 law rocket, a one-shot anti-tank weapon that was useless against infantry dispersed in jungle. They had been in continuous contact for over 70 minutes, repelling 3 NVA assaults, and ammunition was so low that some team members were picking up AK-47 rifles from dead NVA soldiers to have weapons with available ammunition. Benavidez immediately began organizing the position. His first action was medical triage, determining which wounded could be saved, which were beyond help, and treatment priorities. Brian O'Connor's abdominal wound was the most critical among survivors. Without immediate surgery, he would die from internal bleeding or infection. Benavidez applied pressure dressings to the wound, administered morphine to control pain, and marked O'Connor as priority evacuation. Floyd O'Connor's leg wounds were serious but not immediately fatal if bleeding was controlled. Benavidez applied tourniquets above both wounds, cinching them tight enough to stop arterial bleeding, but not tight enough to cause permanent tissue damage from prolonged oxygen deprivation. Shipley's shrapnel wounds were bleeding but not life-threatening. Benavidez packed the worst lacerations with gauze from his medical kit and used battle dressings to create pressure that would control bleeding until proper treatment was available. Yague's shoulder wound had broken his clavicle, but hadn't severed major blood vessels, painful and disabling, but survivable. Benavidez administered morphine and applied a sling to immobilize the arm, reducing pain from movement. The Vietnamese commando with the sucking chest wound a penetrating injury where a bullet had entered the chest cavity, creating a hole that allowed air to enter the pleural space and collapse the lung, required immediate treatment. Benavidez used the plastic wrapper from a battle dressing to create an improvised seal over the wound, taping it on 3 sides to allow air to escape but prevent entry, a field-expedient treatment that prevented the condition from worsening until surgical intervention was available. While treating casualties, Benavidez was simultaneously reorganizing the defense. He took ammunition from dead team members and redistributed it to survivors, giving Yonkman 3 full magazines since Yonkman was still capable of accurate fire despite his leg wound. He positioned the Law rocket with Shipley, who had enough mobility to aim and fire it despite his back wounds. He collected all remaining grenades, discovering 2 more that wounded team members had been too disoriented to remember they carried, and placed them in centrally accessible positions so anyone could throw them when NVA forces approached close enough. He also established communication with the helicopter. The reconnaissance team's radio had been destroyed, but Benavidez had his own portable radio in his medical kit. He keyed the transmitter and contacted Wakefield. Dustoff 71, this is ground party. Multiple casualties need extract. LZ marked with smoke. My position 75 meters northeast. Standing by for extract signal. Wakefield replied, Roger, ground party. Be advised LZ is extremely hot, taking continuous fire. Need you to provide suppression. When we come in for extract. How copy? Benavidez replied, Good copy. We've got limited ammo, but we'll put down everything we have when you approach. Be advised NVA positions are danger close, within 30 meters of our perimeter. Recommend approach from west. That's our clearest field of fire. This communication established the extraction plan. Benavidez would move casualties to the original LZs, 75 meters away. The helicopter would approach from the west, where the reconnaissance team could provide suppressing fire, and extraction would occur as quickly as possible before NVA forces could concentrate their fire on the stationary helicopter. The plan was risky, moving casualties under fire across 75 meters of open ground, while NVA forces would be attempting to kill everyone. But it was the only plan with any chance of success. At 7:15 a.m., an NVA soldier emerged from the grass 5 meters from Benavidez's position, raising his AK-47 to fire. Benavidez, who had his back turned, while treating a wounded soldier, sensed movement and turned. The NVA soldier fired first, hitting Benavidez in the right shoulder. The bullet shattered his clavicle, the impact spinning him around and causing him to drop the medical supplies he'd been holding. Before the NVA soldier could fire again, Benavidez drew his pistol with his left hand and shot the soldier 3 times, killing him at point-blank range. The shoulder wound was serious, fractured clavicle, damaged muscles, severe pain with every movement. Benavidez's right arm was now partially disabled, making rifle operation difficult. He switched to using his rifle left-handed, a skill he'd practiced but never mastered, and continued working. The pain was extraordinary. Fractured clavicles are among the most painful injuries because they move with every breath and every upper body movement. But Benavidez had 8 wounded men to evacuate and no time to address his own injuries. Between 7:15 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., Benavidez made 4 trips between the defensive position and the helicopter landing zone, each trip a desperate journey through 75 meters of elephant grass while carrying or dragging wounded men, under continuous fire from NVA forces that were attempting to prevent extraction. Each trip tested Benavidez's physical limits differently as wounds accumulated and blood loss progressively weakened him. First trip, 7:18 a.m. Benavidez carried Brian O'Connor, the most critically wounded in a fireman's carry. O'Connor draped across Benavidez's shoulders with Benavidez's arms securing O'Connor's arm and leg. O'Connor weighed approximately 180 pounds. His combat equipment added another 40 pounds, and Benavidez was carrying his own equipment plus medical kit, total load exceeding 250 pounds. Moving through elephant grass that tall while carrying this weight was exhausting. The grass limited visibility to arm's length, meaning Benavidez couldn't see NVA forces until they were nearly close enough to touch. He navigated by memory of the terrain from his approach run, moving in what he hoped was a straight line toward where the helicopter should be waiting. Halfway through the trip, at 7:21 a.m., an NVA soldier appeared 10 feet ahead, raising his AK-47. Benavidez, unable to access his rifle while carrying O'Connor, dropped to one knee, a controlled fall that used the drop to absorb O'Connor's weight rather than letting him crash, and drew his pistol. He fired 4 shots, 2 rounds missing, 2 hitting the NVA soldier in the chest. The soldier fell, and Benavidez holstered his pistol, lifted O'Connor again, and continued. The entire engagement lasted approximately 8 seconds, time enough for Benavidez to kill a man and resume walking as though killing was just another task to check off the list. He reached the LZ at 7:23 a.m., found the helicopter hovering at 6 feet, with door gunners firing continuously at NVA positions. Benavidez heaved O'Connor upward toward the helicopter floor where crew members grabbed him and pulled him aboard. The handoff took approximately 10 seconds, Benavidez standing exposed in the LZ, with bullets cracking past, waiting to ensure O'Connor was secured before turning back toward the defensive position. Second trip, 7:35 a.m. This time, Benavidez dragged Floyd O'Connor, same last name as Brian, confusingly, but no relation, using a one-handed drag because Floyd was too wounded in both legs to walk, but too heavy to carry, given Benavidez's own leg wound. Benavidez grabbed Floyd's equipment harness with his left hand and dragged backward, shuffling his feet, pulling Floyd's body across the ground. This method was slower than carrying, but allowed Benavidez to keep his rifle in his right hand and maintain some ability to return fire. The journey took 17 minutes, Benavidez pausing repeatedly to rest, to return fire at NVA soldiers who appeared from the grass, to adjust his grip on Floyd, who was semi-conscious and occasionally struggling, thinking he was being captured. At 7:41 a.m. during this trip, Benavidez encountered an NVA soldier at close range, approximately 15 feet, and both men fired simultaneously. Benavidez's M16 rounds hit the NVA soldier in the face, killing him instantly. The NVA soldier's AK-47 burst struck Benavidez's right shoulder, the same shoulder that had been wounded earlier. Multiple rounds hit. Later examination would reveal 3 separate bullet wounds in his right shoulder area, suggesting either multiple bullets from the burst or one bullet fragmenting on impact with his clavicle. The impact knocked Benavidez down, his right arm going numb from nerve damage. He couldn't move his right arm at all for approximately 30 seconds, during which he lay in the grass waiting to see if other NVA soldiers would appear. When no additional enemies appeared, Benavidez switched his rifle to his left hand, grabbed Floyd's harness with his damaged right hand despite intense pain, and continued dragging toward the helicopter. He reached the LZ at 7:52 a.m., loaded Floyd aboard, and returned to the defensive position. Third trip, 8:04 a.m. Benavidez carried Sergeant Yagwe, the team member with the shoulder wound and broken clavicle. Yagwe could walk with assistance, so Benavidez supported him with an arm around Yagwe's waist, half carrying and half walking him toward the LZ. This was faster than dragging, but required Benavidez to move in a semi-crouch position that stressed his back injury and made returning fire difficult. During this trip, Benavidez was hit by shrapnel twice, once at 8:07 a.m. when a grenade exploded 20 feet away, fragments striking his left leg and creating multiple small puncture wounds, and again at 8:11 a.m. when a mortar round impacted 30 feet away, fragments hitting his back and tearing through his fatigue jacket. The back shrapnel caused particular concern. Benavidez felt the impacts but couldn't assess the damage. He couldn't see his own back. Yagwe was too wounded and disoriented to examine it, and stopping to investigate meant remaining stationary under fire longer. He felt warmth running down his back that indicated bleeding, but couldn't determine severity. He would later learn that several fragments had penetrated his lower back muscles, and one fragment had struck his left kidney, damaging it sufficiently that it would require partial surgical removal. But during the action, he only knew his back hurt, was bleeding, and continued functioning enough that he could keep moving. He reached the LZ at 8:14 a.m., loaded Yagwe aboard the helicopter, and turned back toward the defensive position for the 4th time. Fourth trip, 8:22 a.m. This trip carried Shipley, who had shrapnel wounds across his back, but retained enough mobility to help support his own weight. Benavidez and Shipley moved together, both wounded, both struggling, covering the 75 meters in approximately 12 minutes. During this trip at 8:27 a.m., The mortar round that would cause Benavidez's abdominal wound impacted. The explosion occurred 30 feet from their position, close enough that the blast wave knocked both men down. Benavidez felt immediate searing pain across his back, where multiple shrapnel fragments struck, felt impacts in both legs from additional fragments, and felt something tear in his abdomen. He looked down and saw his fatigue jacket torn open, blood spreading across his stomach, and the distinctive sight of intestines visible through a wound in his abdominal wall. Medical training told him this was a fatal wound without immediate surgery. Combat necessity told him Shipley needed evacuation, and the helicopter was waiting. Benavidez made the decision that would define his Medal of Honor citation. He pushed his intestines back into his body cavity using his left hand, pressed his hand against the wound to hold them in place, picked up his rifle with his right hand, grabbed Shipley with the same hand that was pressed against his stomach, and continued toward the helicopter. He reached the LZ at 8:34 a.m., loaded Shipley aboard, and Wakefield yelled that Benavidez needed evacuation. Benavidez's response, "Still got men back there," became one of the most famous quotes from Vietnam War, a 5-word statement that captured the essence of his determination to save everyone, regardless of cost, to himself. Between 9:00 a.m. and 11:30 a.m., Benavidez made 3 more trips, retrieving the remaining wounded and dead. By now he'd been shot 4 times, hit by shrapnel 15 times, and was losing blood from multiple wounds. His blood pressure was dropping, his vision was blurring from blood loss, and his body was going into shock. Medical literature says that adults can survive losing approximately 40% of blood volume before organ failure begins. Benavidez had almost certainly lost at least that much, and was continuing to function through what doctors later called impossible physiological state. At 11:45 a.m., Benavidez had loaded all remaining casualties and recovered classified documents and radio equipment from the defensive position. He was carrying the last radio, a PRC-25 that weighed 23 pounds, along with his rifle and remaining ammunition. As he approached the helicopter for the final time, an NVA soldier appeared from the grass directly in front of him, raised his rifle, and fired from 10 feet away. The bullet struck Benavidez in the abdomen, penetrating his stomach and causing additional internal bleeding. Benavidez, despite the wound, raised his own rifle and fired, killing the NVA soldier. Before Benavidez could reach the helicopter, another NVA soldier attacked from the side, charging with a bayonet. The bayonet struck Benavidez's left arm, penetrating the bicep muscle and lodging in the bone. Benavidez, unable to dislodge the bayonet with his pinned arm, dropped his rifle, drew his knife with his right hand, and fought the NVA soldier hand-to-hand, while the bayonet was still embedded in his arm. The fight lasted approximately 20 seconds, both men grappling in the grass, before Benavidez managed to stab the NVA soldier in the chest, killing him. Benavidez reached the helicopter at 11:52 a.m., 4 hours and 47 minutes after he'd jumped from it. He was shot 7 times, hit by shrapnel 28 times, bayoneted once in the arm. The second bayonet wound occurred during extraction when another NVA soldier stabbed him in the side as he climbed aboard, and clubbed with a rifle butt that fractured his jaw when he turned to pull the last casualty aboard. He collapsed inside the helicopter, unconscious from blood loss, shock, and exhaustion. The helicopter lifted off at 11:53 a.m., barely flyable from accumulated damage, and headed toward base. During the flight back, helicopter crew members checked casualties and began triage to determine treatment priorities. They checked Benavidez for pulse, found none, and assumed he was dead. One crew member closed Benavidez's eyes, covered him with a poncho, and focused on casualties who appeared savable. When the helicopter landed at 12:19 p.m., medical personnel unloaded casualties, triaged them, and placed Benavidez's body aside for later processing. He was placed in a body bag and zipped closed, standard procedure for KIA handling. Approximately 30 minutes later, a doctor conducting final examination of bodies before transport noticed movement inside Benavidez's body bag. The doctor unzipped the bag, found Benavidez conscious and attempting to move, and realized he was alive despite having no detectable pulse earlier. Benavidez, unable to speak because his jaw was fractured and his throat was full of blood, spat blood on the doctor's face to demonstrate he was conscious. The doctor yelled for immediate surgical team, and Benavidez was rushed into emergency surgery. The surgical team worked for 7 hours repairing damage. They found 7 gunshot wounds: right thigh, right shoulder, left abdomen, right side, left arm, and 2 more in his back. They found 28 shrapnel wounds scattered across his body. They found 2 bayonet wounds, one in the left arm penetrating to bone, one in the right side that had punctured his lung. They found a fractured jaw. They found his intestines outside his abdominal cavity, contaminated from exposure, requiring extensive cleaning before they could be returned to proper position. They found his left kidney damaged by shrapnel and leaking urine into his abdominal cavity, requiring partial removal. They found his right lung collapsed from the bayonet wound. They found his blood volume was approximately 40% below normal from blood loss. The lead surgeon, Major Peter Kamfer, documented that Benavidez survived through combination of exceptional physical condition, extraordinary pain tolerance, and medical impossibility that I cannot explain. Post-surgery assessment concluded that any 3 of Benavidez's wounds individually would be considered potentially fatal, and the cumulative effect should have killed him multiple times during the 6-hour action. The fact that he remained conscious and functional for nearly 5 hours after sustaining the first life-threatening wound defied medical understanding. Benavidez spent 1 year in hospitals recovering from his wounds. He underwent 6 additional surgeries to repair damage, remove shrapnel fragments that continued working their way to the surface, and address infections that developed despite antibiotic treatment. He lost 40 pounds during recovery, developed chronic pain that would persist for the rest of his life, and was told he would likely be medically retired due to the extent of his injuries. The Medal of Honor recommendation prepared immediately after the action was downgraded to Distinguished Service Cross due to lack of witness testimony. Most witnesses were too badly wounded to provide statements, and classified nature of the mission prevented immediate documentation. Benavidez received the Distinguished Service Cross in 1969, second highest military decoration, and returned to active duty despite his injuries. For the next 13 years, the full story of Benavidez's actions remained partially classified. In 1980, a member of the reconnaissance team he'd saved, Brian O'Connor, wrote a statement describing what he'd witnessed. Additional team members provided statements corroborating O'Connor's account. The classified mission reports were declassified and reviewed. In 1981, after extensive investigation confirmed the details, President Ronald Reagan presented Benavidez with the Medal of Honor in a Pentagon ceremony. Reagan's citation noted, "Master Sergeant Benavidez's gallant choice to voluntarily join his comrades who were in critical straits, his extraordinary valor, and his intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty are in the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army." Benavidez retired from the Army in 1976 after 21 years of service. He spent his retirement speaking at schools and military events, sharing his story to inspire others, and advocating for veterans' benefits. He wrote an autobiography, Medal of Honor, published in 1981, that documented his actions in detail. He lived until November 29, 1998, dying at age 63 from complications related to his Vietnam wounds. The injuries he sustained in 1968 caused chronic medical problems that contributed to his death 30 years later. May 7, 1968 began at 6:47 a.m. when Benavidez heard his friends were dying. 7:05 a.m. was when he jumped from the helicopter into the hot LZ. 7:06 a.m. was his first wound. 8:45 a.m. was when shrapnel exposed his intestines. 11:45 a.m. was his 7th gunshot. 11:52 a.m. was when he reached the helicopter for the last time after 4 hours, 47 minutes of fighting. 12:19 p.m. was when he was declared dead and placed in a body bag. 12:50 p.m. was when he spit blood on a doctor to prove he was alive. 1981 was when President Reagan gave him the Medal of Honor. 1998 was when he died from wounds sustained saving 8 men who would have died without him. 1 medic, 7 gunshots, 28 shrapnel hits, 2 bayonet wounds, 6 hours of fighting, held intestines inside with 1 hand, declared dead twice, placed in body bag alive, saved 8 men, proved that courage means continuing when your body is screaming to stop, and that saving your friends is worth dying for, even when you somehow don't die. Not because the wounds didn't hurt, because letting friends die hurts worse. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of people who gave everything to save others. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who taught us that the truest courage is refusing to quit even when your body is broken. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.